What if I told you the first iPhone was released in 1994 and almost no one noticed? It's 1994. The device in your hand is a phone with no physical buttons, just a touchscreen. It can send emails and faxes, store contacts, even run apps. And it predates the iPhone by over a decade. They called it Simon, the world's first smartphone. It was the future, and almost nobody noticed. Why did this groundbreaking gadget vanish? And how did its ideas resurface years later? In 1992, an IBM engineer named Frank Canova had a crazy idea, a computer that could fit in your pocket. Back then, mobile phones were chunky bricks that did little more than call people. Personal digital assistants, PDAs, were separate gadgets for calendars and notes. Canova's vision was to mash these two worlds together years before anyone coined the word smartphone. It was a bold gamble. IBM was known for big business computers and ThinkPad laptops, not pocket-sized gadgets. A smartphone was uncharted territory. That year, IBM built a secret prototype codenamed Sweet Spot and showed it off at the Comdex Tech Expo in Las Vegas. Picture the scene. Amidst a sea of beige desktop computers and clunky car phones, IBM unveils a black device unlike anything else. It's a cell phone and a PDA in one, a touchscreen phone that can send messages and manage your work. Crowds gathered at IBM's booth, straining for a glimpse. A cell phone that could do email? It seemed like science fiction. The demo caused a stir. Executives from Bell South, a major phone carrier, were impressed and wanted in. Turning a trade show marvel into a mass-produced product wasn't easy. IBM first asked Motorola to manufacture the new device. Motorola offered some help but ultimately declined, wary of creating a competitor. Eventually, IBM struck a deal with Mitsubishi Electric to build the devices. They named the project Simon, as in the game Simon Says. By late 1993, IBM and Bell South were ready to announce their creation to the world. The Simon personal communicator was unveiled in November 1993 at a wireless industry conference. The pitch? This wasn't just another gadget. It was the first device to put a computer inside a phone, rather than sticking a phone onto a PDA. One executive boasted it was the first time a company had placed a computer in a cellular phone, rather than placing a cellular phone in a computer. In theory, Simon was the ultimate business tool. Mobile communications made simple, as the slogan went. But building the first smartphone was one thing. Getting people to actually buy it, that would be another challenge. Simon was about to face a reality far harsher than any trade show hype. August 16th, 1994, launch day. IBM Simon finally hit the market, priced at a whopping $899 with a 2-year contract, or $1,999 outright. That's over $2,000 in today's money for a cell phone the size of a brick. It was sold in only 15 US states on Bell South's cellular network. There were no lines of fans camping out overnight. In fact, most people had no idea this thing even existed. No viral Apple keynote, no nationwide rollout, just a cautious regional release for an unproven gadget. The IBM Simon Personal Communicator, 1994, often considered the world's first smartphone, featured a monochrome touchscreen and stylus, predating the Apple iPhone by 13 years. Still, for the lucky few who got their hands on Simon, it felt like science fiction. The device was a chunky dark grey slab with a green-lit LCD touchscreen and an extendable antenna, more like a cordless phone than a modern mobile. Instead of physical buttons, you got a 4.5-inch monochrome touchscreen operated by a plastic stylus. On that screen lived something totally new, icons for built-in apps, or features, as IBM called them. Simon's Navigator interface let you tap through an address book, calendar, notepad, calculator, email, and even a fax program. Years before app stores or iPhones, Simon could wirelessly send emails and faxes, and even receive pager messages. In 1994, that was mind-blowing. Not that IBM was alone in chasing this vision. A year earlier, Apple had launched the Newton Message Pad, a PDA with big promises that famously stumbled. Its handwriting recognition was a joke. The early 90s were full of high-tech gadgets that struggled to find their footing. Simon would have to prove it wasn't just another novelty. One print ad showed Simon with the tagline, Simon says hello. And indeed, Simon had a lot to say. It could doodle. You could draw on the screen and fax your sketch straight from the phone. It could take handwritten notes with the stylus. It even had an early form of predictive text input. IBM called it predictor key, where the phone would guess your next letters as you typed. Remember, this was an era when most people didn't even send text messages yet. On paper, Simon was years ahead of its time. It was basically a smartphone in the age of dial-up modems and pagers. Tech journalists marveled at this unique hybrid device, amazed that a single gadget could truly combine a phone and a PDA. For a moment, it seemed IBM had a real glimpse of the future in its hands. But the future had a funny way of crashing into 1994 reality. Even early reviewers sensed trouble. One noted that Simon was best left to the adventurous gadget lovers. The very features that made Simon a marvel would also become its downfall. The cracks in Simon's genius showed almost immediately. Start with the battery. Simon's battery could barely survive 1 hour of phone calls before dying. 1 hour, that's all. And recharging it fully? It took 14 to 16 hours tethered to an outlet. So for $900, you got a phone that lasted about an hour on a charge. You could drain the battery by lunch and not have a full charge again until breakfast the next day. In 1994, that was a deal breaker, especially for a device costing about $900, $1,099 if you skip the contract. For users, this wasn't just inconvenient, it could be downright embarrassing. Imagine your battery dying in the middle of a crucial business call, or desperately hunting for an outlet at an airport just to keep your mobile phone alive. That 1 hour limit turned using Simon into a high-stakes race against time. The Simon did have a user-replaceable NiCad battery, so business people learned to carry spare battery packs in their briefcases, hoping to make it through a full day. Then there was the size and speed. Simon wasn't just portable, it was luggable. Weighing over a pound, about 510 grams, it was heavier than some laptops. Its software, while groundbreaking, was painfully slow. Early users reported waiting up to 10 seconds for the screen to respond or an app to open. The on-screen keyboard required you to rotate the phone and peck at letters. InfoWorld's reviewer kindly called Simon's keyboard unwieldy. For people used to instant responses from their gadgets, those 10-second lags felt like an eternity. You could tap an icon, count 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, and still be waiting for something to happen. All those futuristic features pushed 1994 hardware to its limits, and it showed. Most crucially, Simon arrived in a world that just wasn't ready. There was no mobile internet yet, no web browser, no online app store. Simon could get email, but only by dialing into a Lotus CC mail server through its modem. Cellular networks were slow 1G analog, great for voice calls and not much else. To compensate for spotty coverage, IBM even offered a cable so you could plug Simon into a landline phone jack and make calls the old-fashioned way. A high-tech smartphone literally tied to a wall cord. The irony was hard to miss. Meanwhile, regular cell phones were getting smaller, sexier, and cheaper. Why lug around a $1,000 brick that barely fits in your briefcase when sleek flip phones were hitting the market? Simon's cutting-edge tricks couldn't outweigh its everyday inconveniences. Many business people who tried Simon ended up quietly returning to their trusty pagers and simpler flip phones. Most Simons ended up gathering dust in desk drawers, a far cry from the personal attachment we have to our phones today. By early 1995, barely 6 months after launch, the IBM Simon was effectively dead. Only about 50,000 units ever sold. IBM and Bell South pulled the plug, discontinuing Simon in February 1995. There would be no Simon 2.0. IBM did start work on a smaller successor codenamed Neon, but it was abandoned before release. It didn't help that Simon was so expensive. Few were willing to pay top dollar for a device plagued with issues. Part of the problem was timing. IBM itself was struggling in 1994 and downsizing its businesses, not exactly eager to keep funding a flop. Bell South was pouring money into expanding its network, not promoting a niche $900 experiment. With both parent companies losing interest, Simon was left an orphan. As groundbreaking as Simon was, its fate was sealed by being too far ahead of its time. The vision was right, but the execution was early, and that opened the door for others to learn from Simon's mistakes and do it better. Simon's failure could have been the end of the smartphone dream, but instead it became a lesson. Other companies picked up where IBM left off, learning from Simon's missteps and waiting as technology caught up. The term smartphone itself wasn't even used until 1997, when Ericsson coined it for a new device. By then, Simon was already a memory. In the late 1990s, a startup called Palm produced the Palm Pilot, a pocket organizer that was simple, fast, and actually fit in your hand. Soon after, BlackBerry put corporate email into a tiny two-way pager and proved there was huge demand for mobile messaging. These gadgets didn't try to do everything at once. They focused on what 90s technology could handle. Palm would go on to sell millions of its PDAs, and BlackBerry's email phones became so addictive they were nicknamed Crackberry. Even giants like Nokia and Microsoft joined in with early smartphone-like devices around the turn of the millennium. Bit by bit, the all-in-one communicator idea was inching toward the mainstream. They slowly accustomed people to the idea of a phone that did more than call, a decade after Simon had first shown it was possible. IBM never got a second chance at this market. IBM, in fact, soon exited the consumer electronics business entirely. It sold off its PC division in 2005 to focus elsewhere. Bell South, Simon's carrier partner, was absorbed into AT&T by 2006. By the time the iPhone arrived, the two companies behind Simon had already moved on. By the time the world was finally ready for true smartphones, IBM was out of the picture, and a very different company was about to succeed where Simon failed. That company was Apple. Apple had flirted with mobile computing in the 90s, remember the Newton PDA, but it never released a Newton phone. Bell South even worked with Apple on integrating a cellular radio into the Newton around 1994, but that project fizzled out. Instead, Apple waited for the right moment. By the mid-2000s, technology had finally caught up to the dream. Phones had color screens and decent cameras. Batteries lasted longer. Wi-Fi and 3G networks meant you could actually use the internet on the go. In short, the world was ready for a smartphone revolution. On January 9, 2007, Steve Jobs took the stage and vowed to reinvent the phone. The device he unveiled was sleek, intuitive, and years ahead of anything before it, the antithesis of Simon's clunky brick. The iPhone had a brilliant multi-touch display, no stylus needed, a decent camera, a full web browser, and it ran on faster networks with a battery that lasted all day. Most importantly, it was cool, a status symbol, something Simon never achieved. Apple's timing and marketing turned the smartphone from a nerdy curiosity into a must-have cultural phenomenon. On launch day, people lined up overnight outside Apple stores just to be the first to buy one, a sight that would have been unthinkable for Simon back in 1994. Ironically, the first iPhone also lacked some features. It couldn't even copy and paste text initially, a shortcoming Simon had been criticized for. But in 2007, people didn't mind. The overall experience was so revolutionary that the few missing pieces were forgiven. Where IBM sold 50,000 Simons in total, Apple now sells that many iPhones in mere hours. The first iPhone wasn't an iPhone, but the iPhone learned from the first. Apple avoided the trap of being too early. It built on the idea when chips, batteries, and networks were finally ready to deliver on the promise IBM had glimpsed back in the early 90s. And with the App Store, Apple solved a problem Simon never got to tackle, bringing third-party developers and millions of users into a single thriving ecosystem. By 2008, Google's Android platform joined the fray, and the smartphone revolution truly exploded. Within a few years, these devices went from luxury gadgets to essential tools for billions. Yet in a way, Simon still lives on. Many of the things we take for granted on our phones were pioneered by that humble IBM device. Touchscreen keyboards, predictive text, mobile email, apps on a phone. Simon did it first. Its icon-driven navigator interface and touchscreen OS were rudimentary by today's standards, but they foreshadowed the mobile app grids and touch interfaces we now take for granted. Its inventor, Frank Canova, went on to help create seminal Palm and Treo smartphones. spreading Simon's DNA through the industry. The IBM Simon proved the very idea of a smartphone could work, even if it took the world another decade to catch up. Simon's rarity has made it a tech collector's item today, a piece of tech history. It even made a cameo as a cutting-edge gadget in the 1995 thriller The Net. In fact, IBM secured a US patent for Simon's design, essentially the concept of a personal communicator smartphone, in 1996. But like Simon itself, that patent quietly sat on the shelf while other companies raced ahead. For the IBM Simon team, the smartphone revolution of the 2000s was both vindication and heartbreak. The world had finally embraced the vision they pioneered, but only long after their own product was consigned to history. And today, billions of people carry smartphones, yet almost none of them know the name of the first one. It's a bittersweet legacy. Simon opened the door for the mobile revolution, but it's Apple and others who walked through it and took the glory. The first iPhone wasn't an iPhone at all. It was an IBM Simon. And though Simon's name has faded into history, its legacy endures every time we swipe a screen or send a message. Without Simon's early experiment blazing the trail, our modern smartphones might have evolved very differently. The ghosts of early innovation never die. They just hide inside our everyday devices.